Composing and contrast. In most instances, contrast is going to be one of the driving factors of your composition, as well as other things we will talk about, such as leading lines and directionals. More about this will be covered a bit later in the class. So let's define these terms, value and contrast. Value contrast is the degree to which values in a composition vary from one to another. Hue or color contrast is how far apart hues are on the color wheel and how saturated they are. So it's important to understand the difference between the two here because they are very similar, but they are very different. We've talked a bit about value contrast, but hue contrast is how far apart the hues are on the color wheel, and also related to that is how saturated they are or how muted they are. I'm going to show some imagery here and talk a little bit about how contrast is working in different images. So here we have a book cover illustration by Ravina Kai, and we can see that many of the elements that we've talked about exist here. So we have color, texture, and line, but one of the driving factors of this is that the richest color and the most contrast is happening around the figure in the central area, which is driving this composition, with the exception of the high contrast of the text. So here's an illustration by John Foster. This is very similar to Ravina Kai image, where you have a very dark figure with very saturated colors that is silhouetted by a lighter area, which brings a lot more attention to that subject and a lot more contrast between the dark and light areas. So some of the darker spots of the composition are placed right against some of the lightest to bring more attention to it. So here is a contemporary painting by Leslie Vance, and it's a very interesting process that's going to work here. She's constructing a traditional still life that's similar to traditional painting, where you might see objects sitting on a tabletop like fruit or wine, but then she uses scraping tools to remove the subject from the still life and to create these abstractions like you see here in this painting from that. So you can see the color value contrast here with the bright saturated yellow and red areas especially, and then the less dominant stripes of color connecting those areas. Against the black, they really stand out and create quite a bit of contrast. But it is color contrast that's driving the composition here. Similar to Leslie Vance's use of color, here is a classic painting by Caravaggio where the saturated colors become an important part of bringing attention to the main subject in the composition because they're so contrasted against the black background here. Here's a photograph by 20th century photographer Minor White. There's a beautiful range of values here, and also very sharp detail. And what Minor White is interested here is the abstraction of forms and looking at the formal quality of this composition rather than having to know exactly what the photograph is about. So this is peeling paint, and the contrast here is the driving element of composition in a way that your eye is moving through the image from the bright white areas that stand out in contrast against the more neutral gray and black areas. Here's a very low contrast photograph that does not include any true blacks or any true whites, but does include a very wide range of gray tones, which adds to a softer translation of this subject. So this is an example of a more quiet kind of image. However, contrast is still a part of its defining element. Here I would like to talk about value in relation to space. One basic fundamental element of design is defined as space. Space relates so closely to value that we can embed space in value when we talk about the principles of design. Space can be defined through values, and it's illustrated well here. If you're looking at a landscape with a wide overview of an area, you're naturally going to see atmospheric perspective. Most artists understand how to illustrate these principles to give the illusion of a vast amount of space that you're looking into. So this is a really good example. If you look at the more saturated colors in the foreground here, the middle ground has some sort of medium saturated colors, and as you go back further into the background, you'll see the colors become lighter and grayer as they go further and further back. So if this were a black and white image, you would see the value change from the darker areas in the foreground to the much lighter areas in the background. In this image, contrast is driving the hierarchy here. So this idea of hierarchy is again very important to be able to define and to understand. So here the first thing we look at are these figures that are they're darker and they're more saturated looking. The second thing is those figures are climbing into this kind of crumbling, cracking statue. And then the third thing that we're looking at is the kind of bluish, greenish, more faded area which goes off further into the background, but everything is composed around. So we can talk about this idea of hierarchy and what we look at first, what we look at second, and what we look at third, and what are the focal points here and the main elements of the composition. We can see that playing out here primarily through contrast. So the final thing I will say here is that using contrast can drive a lot of your compositions.